This is the one of maybe the first of a small series of webinars on the subject of data mesh and how it relates to Hasura and GraphQL and a few other topics. For myself, my name is David Ventimiglia. Again, I'm a solutions architect here at Hasura. With me is Ken Stott. Ken has had leadership roles throughout his career in a number of different industries, in medical technology, in uh, finance, in banking. He's played leadership roles in a number of different capacities and has had some experience in the trenches with data mesh. And he's here to help, if no one else, me, understand better what data mesh is, the role that it plays, and some of the concerns that arise therein. Ken, did you want to jump in? Did I miss anything on the old introductions or anything you want to add to that?
No, that was very complete. Thanks, David. I do want to bring a bit more of a. I don't want to repeat what what Zhamak Dehghani, might say about data mesh. He does it better than me. I want to bring more of a practitioner's role. Some of the things that have happened as I've attempted to implement this, maybe some ideas on ways to resolve some of those issues.
Fantastic. Thank you. And a little bit about the format. This is intended to be as we often like to say it at Hasura, it's a somewhat casual. It's a discussion. We encourage participation from the audience. We welcome it. We thank you for that. I think Ken has mercifully a modest number of slides we'll run through on kind of presenting on the topic in question. Um, that will be followed by some discussion among, if no one else, me and Ken. But again, the audience is welcome to participate. As that occurs, if folks want to tee up questions in the chat, both during Ken's initial presentation, but also later in the webinar, I will do my best to relay those into the discussion. Unless I've missed anything else, Ken, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, could you present, are you going to present the slides? We should have
I
talked.
can. I can absolutely present the slides. One second while that is happening. All right.
Let's go to slide 3.
Slide 3 already. All right. Let me share. All right. Well, um, Sandeep, can you, while you're Sandeep is, I think, also in the call and is the host for this meeting. Can you share or can you add sharing privileges for both Ken and me? Um, While that's happening, let me bring up slide number 3.
I can start even without the visual.
You can probably start, and maybe you have permission to share.
Maybe I do. We should have all figured that out.
Fantastic. Looks like I can share. Ken, I'm going to go ahead and share your slides. Let's do that.
Okay, great.
I
Uh,
think is this the slide you had intended? Data mesh designed to address the historic failures.
it is. So as
Great.
I said, I'm not going to repeat um, kind of other people's perspectives on data mesh because they do it a lot better than I. But let me give you a quick intro. I'm going to try to just do this in bite-sized chunks and then leave some opportunity for questions and let us sort of take it where it takes us. So just to set the stage, data mesh was based on a paper uh, authored by Zhamak Dehghani, who was a consultant at ThoughtWorks in 2019. She drew her inspiration from other architectural design ideas like domain-based architecture, best practices that she'd observed at other institutions, and her own observations. The main observation that she had was that analytical data is usually organized in a way that is too distant from the producers of that data, and that creates a lot of problems in drawing value out of the data that's being produced. So she espoused this theory, what I'd call it a socio-technical theory. It's about people and organization and governance and standards, data and systems. and she has four key principles, and we can talk about those later. But what I thought was most fascinating about all of this is that she absolutely, I mean, she just refuses to provide any implementation details. And in fact, she challenges practitioners and vendors to figure it out. The other thing that I thought is so fascinating about this is it got traction, right? Despite all that lack of detail, people seem to pay attention. Big corporations are attempting to implement this pattern. Vendors are trying to create products that help those corporations implement these patterns. And so, and I have myself have gotten caught up in that. I've tried to implement this pattern myself, and I've analyzed people who are starting to think about doing that. One of the more interesting things is if you're in a large organization, a lot of these things are in place, but maybe not exactly organized specifically to accomplish the data mesh sort of design pattern. But you're probably like 50% of the way there. You probably have a lot of the things in place to kind of get you there. And I've analyzed many of those situations over the years, and I have some thoughts about them. David, I'm just going to stop there. And does that inspire you to, ask me a question or anyone else? Yeah, I can't hear you, David. You're on mute, by the way.
Apologies for that. There was some background noise. You have more experience with data mesh than I do, but what I would say is coming into this, I had I would say a similar experience insofar as I encountered the foundational material on the subject of data mesh. Um, it made a lot of sense to me, and I responded to it, but I struggled to find some details for practitioners.
Yep.
How do we eventually get to an implementation? And I think hopefully in this webinar we'll get a little bit further downfield, as I said yesterday to you.
I think I have some things I can suggest around doing that.
Mm,
But we are going to stay fairly conceptual because this is an introductory webinar with follow-on webinars that will get into more of the details as well.
absolutely.
Um, the other thing that I think you kind of hit on was it made sense. I think the reason it makes sense is it kind of is the way the world seems to work and ought to work. And what it does is it just formalizes it. And it gives people kind of a target state to drive towards that all just feels like, yeah, that should work, right? It just feels like it's possible. And so it's inspired a lot of people to move in this direction. You want to we can do the next slide because I think even to answer questions, even though I want to avoid getting too deep into kind of the paper itself, we do need to level set just a little bit so we're all kind of thinking about this at the same level. There are four principles. So the first is domain-oriented decentralized data ownership. What this means is that when I said before that analytical data is often in other organizations, we want that brought closer to the data that's producing it. So we want kind of full stack data domains that have the ability to ingest, transform, refine, and build operational data and analytical data, and then surface that as some sort of data asset that people outside that domain can consume that has value. The next piece is data as a product. So data as a product is a very conceptual idea, but I think it's worth bringing up. And the idea is that if you're in a data domain and you've defined these data sets or data solutions that you might describe as an offering, you should attempt to do it in a way that's kind of like a retail operation. You should have names for things. You should be able to describe the things. You should be able to sample the thing, try it out. You should be able to understand the cost of acquiring it. And the entire experience should be relatively frictionless And in the paper's words, it should be a delightful experience. People should sort of enjoy doing it and feel like their needs were met through this. Um, and I think frequently that's not the case. The third one is, I think, maybe the most complicated for people to think through, but it's this idea of self-serve data infrastructure as a platform. Now, it also includes, as we dig further into it, governance and standards and a couple of other things. But the key idea here is that those domains are not doing everything on their own. They are using common infrastructure to accomplish their goals, and that's in common governance and standards so that the output of those domains has some consistency. Um, the other thing that's very, very important about the self-serve data infrastructure as a platform is that it is data agnostic. It just cannot reference anything about those domains in any specificity. And I think the tell for this is if those platforms are very metadata driven, it's highly likely that they're sort of achieving that objective, right? Because that metadata provides the language for the domain to kind of stand up, their specific needs within it. The fourth one, I think, is the most misunderstood. Federated computational governance. People read that and they start thinking about federated data governance or data governance, and it has nothing to do with that, in fact. It's really about data usage, right? So the fact that we have the self-serve data infrastructure as a platform helps us provide some consistent data product, but they're independent. And in order to get value, you must have a way to correlate them and then aggregate or perform other operations to ultimately derive insight for specific use cases. And frequently, what people end up doing is they may do all these other things, but they forget to do that last bit. And then it just doesn't work out. People need to understand how to create composite data sets for specific use cases. And if you don't have that capability in your data mesh, this is what will happen is those domain owners will end up getting requests to create very narrow data products for a very small set of customers, down to an audience of one. They'll be overwhelmed with doing all that and overwhelmed with maintaining all of that. This is about creating reusable data products. It's sort of like this idea of being able to correlate your independent data products is kind of having assembly instructions provided with your data products, right?
Makes a lot of sense.
Let me stop. Let me stop there, David, and see if any of this makes sense to you or anyone on the call.
Absolutely. It seems to make sense to me. I think, would you say, I mean, there's been a great deal of foundational material written on the subject of data mesh with a great deal of detail, but if we wanted to provide a capsule summary of data mesh and extract like a one pager, would these principles be a good place to start for that?
Yeah, this is it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think these principles as outlined here are represent sort of the state of the art from that foundational material that's been written on data mesh. Do these principles and what's written here, does this resonate with your experience? Is this informed by your experience as a data architect and as a leader in these sorts of organizations?
Oh, 100%.
Fantastic.
I think it's amazing when you have good data platforms in place and people leverage that, the amount of value you can get out of people who use that in these individual business functions or data functions that have to produce data. I mean, that's a huge accelerator to delivery, and it helps the consumers because it makes things a little bit easier for them to see some consistency between these independent teams.
I
I've
like
done a lot of analysis, and it all comes down to that lower right item, and that's where everything goes wrong.
That's fantastic. Again, I like this slide because again, there's been a great deal of material written on the subject, but we're all busy, and so if we're trying to get to grips with what data mesh is, I think this is a good starting point.
Well, this is not copyrighted material. I think I pulled that directly from the article, by the way. But it's the
Absolutely.
best summary that I've found. Um, you wanted me to speak to this, David?
Well, one of us should. Let's go for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of a visual of what those other what the last slide is, right? The key thing to point out is that there's a lot of effort put into these domain agnostic data platforms, and it involves lots of different kinds of services, right? You have to have data processing services, data storage services, transformation, data movement, but also control services, metadata management, access capabilities, policy enforcement, and policies and standards. Again, all domain agnostic. They should never reference any of the individual concerns of these respective data domains. And then the data domains are then sort of free to actually produce things that people, will find quite valuable. The other thing that's often missed again, and it goes back to that lower right thing on federated computational governance, is this data product correlations that you see in the bottom of the diagram. Very important that that is part of your overall design. The domain instance is just a likely kind of implementation of that. But I think one of the keys is that the domains need to be completely free to deal with the problems that they're dealing with in their environment, right? You've got history that they've got to address. You've got specific, maybe vendor products that you have to integrate with. All these things are going to influence your domain stack, right? But generally speaking, at ingest data, you'll probably have an operational data store. You'll have some analytics. You got to conform all of that into some sort of product with some sort of control layer to manage access to it.
Got it. Got it. By the way, just as a sidebar, how, if at all, does this relate to domain-driven design? Eric Adams's sort of foundational work on that subject. I know domain-driven design and data mesh are not obviously not identical, but there seems to be some relationship um, between between these concepts.
There is, and I haven't thought about it
But
to be
what
other
I was, yeah,
other than
I guess.
I am repeating what others have told me that it was inspired by domain-driven design.
Yeah, I think that's quite clear because some of these, again, these are not necessarily profound concepts, but the idea um, of domain ownership, of bounded context, um, of well-defined responsibilities, and sort of federated um, uh, data development. I think this
Mhm.
also relates to the sort of federated data mesh
Yeah,
architecture as well.
I can't imagine that, and I
Yeah,
wish I had a better answer for you. I'll study that one for
don't
you.
worry about it. I think,
But I do think that they are related, and I think it relates to some of the other things I said just a moment ago, right? The key is domains have to have sufficient freedom to optimize their delivery, right?
perfect,
So,
perfect.
um, and I know you get into trouble when you don't provide them that level of freedom. Because she refuses to mention products and how you might implement it, this is my own sort of diagram that I use to sort of think about how a domain stack might be built. I think this is pretty typical. These are the kinds of products you'll often see. But it all kind of depends on the overall objective of the domain. So you can have a domain that's really more an analytics domain, right? Or sometimes we call them derived domains. They may have very few operational data stores. They may just be ingesting data from other domains so that they can provide insights across a broader sort of organizational boundary that people have an interest in, right? So you're not going to have all these things. This is more like a wish list. And based on the mission, scale, complexity of your domain, you pick these things, right? Because they fit with the problem you're trying to solve for.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think there's a lot going on this chart, on this slide, obviously. I believe we don't expect there won't be a quiz on this slide or a test on this slide. I think among the things that you're trying to convey here is there are options, right? We don't, folks on the call, we don't have to memorize everything that's on this chart. It's just to give a flavor of the wide variety of options that are available. Would that be fair to say, Ken?
It's mostly the answer to, she refuses to give implementation details.
And
I'll send you a few.
we should be fair to be fair to the original data mesh community. Um, you know, implementation details have not been abundant. We don't know if it's a matter of refusal, but we have not encountered a great deal of implementation detail. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be a little provocative. I mean,
I like
she
it.
says this is the boundary she's going to
That's
operate
right.
in, being conceptual, and she thinks that there are other people who would be better at doing those things. And a little bit, it's in the spirit of every place needs to figure it out because they have constraints that you have to deal with, right?
Right. I,
So again, that's all I'm really trying to convey here, and I think it's just a simple way for you to think about how am I going to organize assets to ultimately, provide data products up to a consumer.
some questions from the folks on the chat, and
Yeah.
um, this may trigger some thoughts for, if not now, later on in this discussion or in a subsequent uh, webinar. But Don would like to know, the ideas and concepts are fairly clear, are pretty clear. We'd love to see some examples or some discussions of successful data mesh implementations. I'd like to see some discussions of successful and even not so successful data mesh implementations. Out in the wild where people have actually tried to put this into practice, where you've tried to put this into practice. What's happened? What's gone right and what's gone not so right? But I think we'll probably come to that. But that's something to think about.
Yeah, I think that diving into a real life use case could be pretty useful. Um, I'm not prepared to do that, but I do have another level of detail around kind of kind of a narrative around how this stuff goes wrong and how I think you could improve it, which
I think that will
help a
help
bit.
us converge on that on an answer to Don's request.
Yeah.
Robert would like to know, or Robert's comment is, uh, my understanding is the data mesh topology not only provides domain-driven data, but also decentralized access. And this will lead into more detailed discussions of GraphQL, as opposed to, say, Apollo Federation, which Apollo Federation for folks on the call, um, within the realm of GraphQL, uh, Apollo Federation is an approach to integrating disparate data together.
Mhm.
So the comment is, data mesh provides decentralized access as opposed to Apollo Federation. It appears it is being described more as Apollo Federation. Can you speak to this? We may come when we get to parts of this on the subject of GraphQL. We may come back to this question that Robert has. Um, but if you have any comments on that, let us know, Ken. Otherwise, we will save that for later.
Right. I think the fact that you might have an access layer that people flow through to get to the individual domains, it makes it arguable as to whether it's centralized or decentralized, right? You've got a coordinator that gets you to the underlying domain so it can deliver its data. If that coordinator, right, the access layer that does that for you is both a distributed function and one that faithfully provides the data that the domain is providing without adding additional, transformations or other operations that would alter the data. I think that would meet decentralized access sort of definition from my perspective.
Got it.
But people
Um,
could have different points of view, which I respect. But
got it. Um, we have, I think, Bamlaku, if you want to jump into the call, and we have a few questions from the audience. Go ahead and jump in, or you can ask your question in the chat. Um, Otherwise, I think again, we're just getting a flavor of the pieces and the products that are available in this slide. I think where we're going to in the next slide, Ken, is probably drilling down into some of these. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk more about in my perspective, how this typically goes wrong. And and it's been such a repeated what am I trying to say? Repetitive pattern that I've identified that I just find it really compelling way to explain the typical sort of situation that people end up in. So this is, in my view, how people kind of think it will work at the end of the day if they fully implemented data mesh. Domains have some sort of probably affinity for certain types of consumers. Most of those consumers will work with a primary domain to get the information that interests them, and life will work well, right? But when I've analyzed this, as people have attempted to implement it, this is the situation I've typically found. If you go to the next slide.
All right.
Let me,
What really happens?
yeah. So, and I don't think this will surprise anyone. Just the question is, how the heck do we solve it? But let me give you my little story, right? The consumer on the right-hand side goes to domain one and says, I need a product that you don't have, but you seem to be the one that can provide it to me. Two things are going to happen. Domain one is going to say, we can get you that, but I'm missing some things. I'm going to go ahead and get that from some other operational system or from some domain two or domain three. Or they're going to tell the consumer, I don't have that. I can give you part of that. The consumer is then going to go to domain two or domain three or all the way back to these operational systems. They're going to get the missing bits. They're going to then bring that into their own systems, probably store it, build their own systems to composite that data and produce the data set to solve their problem. And I guess if you do that once, it seems maybe okay, like we had to do it, it's tactical, etc. The problem that I've discovered is that most data feeds say online between 5 to 7 years in every study that I've ever done. The second thing is whenever I've gone into an organization and studied all of these data flows, this is what immediately comes out. About 2/3 of this is all wasted. It's all intra-domain traffic, right? That's being used to provide this data to this consumer. You're duplicating storage, you're duplicating data feeds. And this is the next thing that happens. Because of all this intra-domain activity, consumers are seeing data that seems like it's similar, but it's different. And then they lose trust. So now they're doing extra work. And finally, data governance, God help them, they sort of kind of lose sight of what's really happening and they just start pouring tons of money into solving this problem. This whole thing just really devolves into kind of one big ball of yarn. Everyone's trying to do their job, but it just doesn't work out. David, have you seen this sort of situation? Has anyone else sort of been in there?
I have seen this situation again. Yeah, there are often, if not called data mesh, there have been data integration projects that I've been involved in that have been announced with fanfare. Uh, but when um, when data again among the four principles of data mesh, one of them being data as a product, it's part of that is to actively curate and promote the quality of the data within those. And when that's neglected, then the use of the data mesh or the data catalog or the data integration point languishes, and because trust has been lost, and it sometimes they can become
Data quality is
ghost
part of that.
projects. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to speak over you, David. I think data quality is part of that. And it's those two boxes at the bottom in the four principles, right? I think to a great extent, data quality and some consistency is brought with using a federated data agnostic data platforms with some governance and standards to oversee that. But the other piece is this ability to composite your data for specific use cases in a reliable way.
I
And
think
this
that's,
and
I think,
this is where there's hardly any solutions out there that do this, in my view, effectively.
I think that's right. And I think this is a key idea that we and you are going to be driving toward. And I suspect this will get us closer to answering. Robert had a question. He had asked a question in the chat earlier about um, arguably about Apollo Federation, but the underlying basis was to what degree does data mesh involve um, decentralized data access? Uh, and I think
Right.
that will be involved in this. There will be a trade-off, I think. Maybe you could speak to this.
Well,
A trade,
again, I think it's the semantics here,
sure, absolutely.
right? Right. We go through networks, we go through all kinds of centralized services to get access to data, right? My contention is that if you provide additional services to access that data, you're not altering it, but you're giving people the ability to composite data. You're giving them the ability to aggregate data at scale in a consistent way. That is still decentralized access.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. But what about, and maybe we'll come to this, but um, eventually, I think there will be a desire to integrate data across domains, right?
Mhm.
To establish relationships among data elements from different domains. Um, in a federated data access pattern, who owns those relationships, right?
Yeah, so that's a governance question.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I think it's first of all, it's whatever you want. But I think that initially relationships should be owned by the domain. So the domain should say, I believe these data elements and these data sets have a relationship to this other data product. I think that there still must be a federated team that is overseeing the holistic sort of consistency of the entire semantic layer that ultimately creates.
I think that's right. One of the concepts that comes into this, as was discussed in the chat, is federation, Apollo federation, but just this concept of a
Yeah.
federated data
So,
arc.
so let me get to that. And this is my whole,
Mhm.
this is sort of my could be my final slide. Um, but in
Oh,
my view, what's really missing is that fourth bucket, the federated computational governance. And while the original data mesh doesn't doesn't use this phrase, so maybe there's alternate ways to do it. But for me, the missing link is some sort of platform agnostic semantic layer that defines data products and correlates them, right? And correlate, right, in this context means connections or relationships so that people can take multiple data products, combine them, and then aggregate them in ways to generate insight that is consistent across all consumers. So, um, in my view, if SQL is your access layer, you got problems because it's way too wide open and way too much of a toolbox for people to do what I'm describing. And I know this is a bit of a minority view, but I think it has to do maybe with the tooling that had been available and the history of this particular standard. But I am a huge fan of GraphQL as a way to express that semantic layer, right? It's easily readable metadata. Humans can understand it, but it's also machine readable, right? I really like the standards committee. I followed them very closely. I think they do a wonderful job of really refining that standard without getting in the way of practitioners, you know, really providing their own value on top of that, which gets to this community. It's one of the more vibrant communities out there, which means there's tons of tooling to really help you. And then again, in my view, it's just needed, right? This whole data mesh architecture kind of makes sense. It aligns to the real world. but we have to have a way to organize data products and govern access and satisfy this sort of self-serve need. And I think GraphQL does a good job of that. As a standard, as a tool, there's a lot of variation, a lot of variation. And I would have never done this 5 years ago. But with the advent of automated GraphQL tools, I think this is feasible and I think it's advisable to do. And in fact, in my last big project, I used Hasura, which is why I guess I'm talking as a consultant on your webinar today. So I have a lot of familiarity with Hasura, and I'm a big fan.
That's fantastic. I'd love to dive into the details of that project and how it relates to this. But I do have, I guess, a few other questions. I know we promised to be conceptual, but I just can't resist. I've put this
Sure.
off for far too long. How do I get a data mesh? I think earlier you had said that, and I believe this is true. Often, organizations will be part of the way there towards having a data mesh, 50% of the way, 60% of the way, some portion of the way there, but they're not all the way there. There's a gap. There's some work that still needs to be done. It's in those implementation details. So I've been persuaded. I like these four principles. I want a data mesh. How do I go about getting one? What do I do? What are some pieces that are missing?
Well, first of all, that depends a lot on where you sit in an organization. If you're the CTO, you declare it, and you can start with a few suggestions I might
Well,
offer.
that's a good question. Another question is, do you have you don't necessarily have to have an opinion on this, but I'm curious. Data mesh, sketch a profile of types of organizations that would most benefit from the ideas, the concepts of a data mesh. Maybe there are some types of organizations that
Mhm.
can put this off. And if you're trying to think of like types of organizations, a couple candidates are at one end of the spectrum is, solo entrepreneurs or startups. At the other end of the spectrum might be enterprise organizations.
Yeah.
Um, who's the
Now,
audience for data mesh?
big companies for the most part.
Okay.
And I think part of the reason it's gotten traction is it fits very well with heavily regulated organizations. So federated data governance has been around for decades. I have to apologize to anyone who has to endure it, but it's there. One of the nice things, and the reason it's gotten traction, is data mesh is a nice fit. It kind of starts to make sense of how the federated data governance teams can actually move towards implementation that supports their needs. And this is a big, I think those organizations are the ones that have really glommed onto this and supported it. Um, but
Okay.
if
Okay.
data in general is what you produce, right? If that's your content, things like this could also be useful to you as well.
Okay. So within a big company, maybe an enterprise company, as we dial up and down the org chart, searching for a a a persona that would for which this would resonate. Sketch the persona of a person within an org chart where we're thinking, I think, kind of closer up towards a leadership role. Is that right? Or maybe not.
Well, I think each person, if it resonates with you, has different things they can do to move their organization forward or participate or contribute towards moving their
But
organization.
if I'm a Java developer turning around a wrench on like something deep into the belly of an ETL pipeline, I'm probably not going to
Yeah, what you want
I'm
to
not
be
going to launch
doing
a
is
data mesh in it.
advocating. If you're in that role and you're like, this is cool, I wish I worked in an organization that functioned like this, you need to advocate for data platforms, right?
Okay, who am I advocating to?
Well, ideally, there is a central team at some
Okay.
level, right? So if you're the Java developer, central could mean different things, right? It may be at the divisional level. It may be within a business function. It may be at the enterprise level. It kind of
So
depends.
let's say it's for lack of another candidate, let's just throw the CTOs into
Mhm.
the arena. Let's say it's a CTO who's at least thinking about this as a tactical, if not a strategic initiative. Uh,
You want to know his motivations or what's
what I
driving?
want to know is I've decided to do this to move the organization in this direction. Um, what should my organization like? Again, I ask, how do we get to a data
Yeah,
mesh?
if you're in a leadership role and you are trying to do this, uh, uh, and you're trying to do this, the first thing that I've done, because I've been in that situation and tried to execute on this, right? The first thing to do is to get a current state understanding of data flows, what data is at rest. And if you've got any sort of data quality statistics, maybe data incident reports, et cetera, start to see if that slide 8, see if I'm not lying, but I'll bet you'll be able to build that picture yourself and be able to quantify all of those things you see on the left. And when you get that
Okay,
single picture and you quantify it in your organizational terms, you're going to get the budget because you're going to be explaining how you're going to be able to accelerate the delivery of data and you're going to drive down costs.
got it. Um, let's talk about
You might also
technology.
need to think about how to organize your teams, right? Because this implies some perhaps reorganization of people and data and assets, right, to achieve a data
Right.
mesh.
Um, let's talk about technology. Uh, what are, because at the end of the day, this will be implemented in some kind of technology. Um,
Mhm.
there are only so many options. So let's talk about those. To support these four principles, what are some of the options? And I think they're on that eye chart slide that comes next. But for domain or oriented decentralized data ownership and architecture,
Mhm.
what's some technology that I can use so that I satisfy that principle? I think probably like is what I have in mind, I guess. So in terms of technology, we have databases, we have um, we have SQL, we have ETL pipelines. That's another way of moving data around. We have data catalogs, we have GraphQL, we have enterprise service, we have service buses. Um, how do I think about bringing some of these technologies in to build up this data mesh?
Ideally, what you're referencing would be the self-serve data infrastructure, right?
Yeah, because I remember you indicated that those two bottom quadrants, the bottom left and especially the bottom right, are the two quadrants that are probably underserved uh, within data mesh. So let's talk about self-serve data infrastructure as a platform.
Well, so self-serve data infrastructure is a platform. It's going to be all the same suspects. If you're at a large organization, you probably have a database administration team. Hopefully, they let you manage your data effectively, but they're providing some levels of standards. They're providing support to you, and they probably have some sort of polyglot strategy so that they've got the main culprits that are required for different kinds of data use cases. MongoDB, very effective at a lot of different levels within data processing, even up to very large scale processing, particularly as you get into AI, vectorization, et cetera. MongoDB is a nice tool. Obviously, all your relational database tools are great at the sort of operational data store level. Some of those may work okay as you get into the large scale analytical data stores. Large scale analytical data stores, you've kind of got your warehouse flavor, you kind of got your BI flavor, and you got your data science flavor. The BI flavor, for lack of a better one, products like Snowflake, great at doing very, very large BI-oriented warehouses. Uh, you probably got some sort of medallion architecture idea in the way you build out your data warehouse. You may have data movement technologies, again, that are managed centrally, but you're able to access them to move data through that data warehouse medallion architecture. On the data science side, right, it's tools like Databricks, which is a very sort of open-ended platform for organizing data science-based assets, but also more specialized products. Graph products can be quite helpful. Graph is phenomenal in the way it can help provide context to LLMs, for example. So those are all the things you're thinking of in the large scale analytics space as you think of BI versus data science. And finally is access, right? So your access layer to me, data catalogs are fine, but they rarely provide they don't provide technical self-service, right? They're often business oriented and they have some capabilities, but not a lot. And data catalogs rarely do a good job of explaining relationships between the elements in the data catalog.
I was going to
Um,
ask you about that. Thanks for throwing that in. You sort of anticipated one of my questions, which where I was going is again, if I want a data catalog, I could ask, well, how do I get a data catalog? And broadly speaking, I can think of, you know, sort of two categories or a mixture of both. There's build versus buy, right? I can write code or I could buy a product or I could do both. So let's talk about products for a second. What product categories seem to offer or say that they offer something like a data mesh? By my lights, the data catalog community has jumped into the fray to
mhm.
offer their products as a data mesh or as a part of the data mesh. And I welcome that, but I feel like there's a gap there. And I think you
Yeah, and
just
I
pointed
don't
out.
know if I don't know if I've ever seen the assertion that a product is the data mesh, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they assert that they are a data mesh, but they
Solution.
with some justification are part of the solution. But I guess the point that I wanted to drill down is there's still a gap. And on that part of the data mesh map, it seems to be a self-serve data platform and on those relationships.
Yes. Again, I think this is where GraphQL works. Again, a big Hasura fan. I think Hasura does an excellent job of providing a technical facing self-serve platform that includes some enforcement of relationships, which really helps in that fourth bucket there in the lower right. Um,
Looking into this again, you know, some sort of terms of art that you find together. Data mesh and data catalog, I find these things appear together. They co-occur. Um,
but they,
data mesh and GraphQL do not often co-occur. Those two communities don't seem to really be communicating. Um, so I think this is a novel contribution here is to bring GraphQL into the data mesh conversation.
I would say I'm not the first person who thought of it first. I've heard of it previously. And in fact, there's a Gartner article that talks about GraphQL is really climbing up, is moving, um, while it's principally for sort of web applications, kind of at the more scoped down like app development space, is moving into this large scale data access space. In fact, Gartner had indicated that something like 10 to 15% of their requests around GraphQL are related to that. That's a direct hit on data mesh. Data mesh needs a data access layer to serve as part of the data platforms that can be used to produce, right, federated computational governance.
As let's talk about that data access layer and federated computational governments. You talked about this briefly before, but let's talk about it again. What about SQL? Why can't SQL be the basis for?
Yeah, and in fact, I think Databricks and Presto and Trino and Starburst, and they sort of imply that they could be part of the solution to this. The general problem is that and I might be proven wrong, but I've never been able to establish cross-product relationships, right? So I'll give like a Trino example. It always surfaces as a data source bounded by a catalog. And then I'm going to have multiple catalogs and I can build views that cross those catalogs. What I can't do is establish any concept, at least in their metadata, around relationships between things that cross catalogs. Does that answer your question,
I
David?
think it does. And
That's part of
no,
the issue.
no surprise. These are leading
Sec-
questions that I'm asking.
Second issue is it's too open-ended, right? You can kind of do anything which isn't going to provide that consistency as you correlate these products together and aggregate them to provide insight, right? So it ends up becoming too much work, too much maintenance work, and it doesn't really achieve the objectives of the computational governance, in
Yeah,
my point of view.
in my experience working with GraphQL, what I would say is there's a relationship between GraphQL and SQL. They're both general purpose query languages. They are somewhat isomorphic insofar as, at least for relational data sources, there's nothing you can say in GraphQL that you can't say in SQL, although the converse isn't necessarily
Right.
true. However, and this comes from a lifelong SQL fan. Um, there's diversity in SQL. There are obviously like a wide variety of dialects of SQL.
Another
It's not
problem.
it's not designed to be machine readable. It's not as well constrained as GraphQL is. GraphQL um, probably is less powerful than SQL is, but it's highly regular. It's more machine readable, and it has a nice set of constraints. Um,
Right. The other thing, and people bring that up to me from time to time, is the authors of the graph of your GraphQL platform. They can, if there are things that are required to be expressed in GraphQL, the platforms are open-ended enough that you can still achieve that, right?
that's right. We
Not
are
the, not the consumer, but the author can provide those capabilities. I know we're almost out of time, David. Do you want to take us
absolutely. I
out?
was going to say, so we're closing in on the end of this session, and I want to respect people's time. I think so. Thank you for this presentation, Ken. My takeaway, I'd love your comment, is a few simple things. Most people are pretty close to having a data mesh, but there are some gaps. The gaps tend to dwell on these two bottom quadrants, self-serve data infrastructure and federated computational governance. To fill in those gaps, there aren't really that many tools and technologies uh, available or in the offing. And GraphQL is a pretty good candidate for filling in those two gaps. And folks who are thinking about data mesh might want to think about adding GraphQL into the mix. Am I close to where we're going with this?
Oh yeah, I mean that's obviously the point, of course. The other point is, I think there are parts that have more mature offerings. It's this data access layer, this ability to create a self-serve data access layer that includes data composition as one of its capabilities, so that you don't fall into the trap of building data products that are too specific. It's all about creating a balance around reusability around those data products. Because if you don't do that, you're going to end up in that diagram 9 that I showed you.
Fantastic. If um, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to sketch out some ideas of where we might take this in future webinars on the topic of data mesh, and while that's happening, you know, as in the chat, um, encourage folks to you can deposit questions in the chat or email us with comments or questions or things you'd like to know about data mesh, GraphQL and Hasura. But Ken, where do you think we might go with this mini series on data mesh?
Oh, let's dig into this data access platform because that's the one that I find that's most interesting and the one people perhaps misunderstand the most. I think there's a lot you can do there. Data catalogs. Again, I'm really more at the top end because the bottom end is more mature and it's more about reorganizing existing assets to a great extent to achieve those objectives. The less mature piece is the access piece. And I think I'd like to spend more time on that in our follow-ups.
I think that's great. Folks on the call, appreciate you for joining and being part of this. This has been somewhat conceptual, but we're starting to dive down into some of the more concrete aspects of data mesh. There's an abundance of concepts in data mesh and a shortage of practical advice, and I think that's where we're heading. Uh, any final comments? But otherwise, Ken, I appreciate your involvement in this and appreciate everyone joining. And look forward to seeing you on in this webinar series and in other webinars that we have at Hasura. So thank you all.
Have a wonderful day, guys. Take
All right,
care.
cheers. Bye-bye.